excited to have Carolyn here today. She can probably give a much better introduction of herself than I can, but super excited for her discussion about zoning and race. And with that, we'll hand it off to Carolyn and get started.
Great, thank you. So I've been speaking on zoning for a couple years now, but for some reason I always bury the slide that tells you who I am when I should just start with that. So I recognize several faces in the room. I stumbled into zoning in 2014, found myself working at the zoning counter for the city of Pittsburgh, and it's consumed my life since then. So I've moved on from the city of Pittsburgh to just trying to tackle the bigger issues of zoning. In the city office, it was very day-to-day. You were swamped with just managing applications, and thinking bigger picture wasn't, there wasn't time, there wasn't capacity. So since I've stepped back from that role, I've been able to think bigger picture and look at issues that bothered me when I was processing applications, and trying to find out what's really going on with zoning so that we can do it better. So I was very fortunate last year. I was selected to be the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency's Kathy A. Possinger Housing Policy Fellow, and that provided me with financial and other support to really start to look deeper at one of my questions, which is how Pittsburgh zoning districts are promoting different housing options depending on your race. So I'm going to, today in the presentation, give you a little introductory ground setting for what zoning is. I could spend a very long time talking about that, so I'm going to try and keep that part brief before we then jump into the research that I did and the results that I found. And then I'm going to end with a little bit more of a presentation on how do we change zoning, and how can groups like this get involved in promoting good change in the zoning laws in the city. So I was a City of Pittsburgh employee for several years, left. I have my own zoning consulting firm now called Details Reviewed, and I have written an illustrated short story on the joys, as I like to say, of going through the zoning process. And again, with some of the faces in the room, I know you've experienced these firsthand. So what is zoning? Zoning is a body of laws established at the local level, either the municipality or the county, and they really regulate where we can live, work, and play. And they also influence how we get in between all those different activities. The purpose of the document is frequently phrased in some variation of to promote or protect health, safety, welfare, and morals. And I could, again, give you like a treatise on each one of these, but morals is the one that I am personally focusing in on. And again, I'm not going to go into too much depth in that tonight, but I do want you to pay attention to the graphic that I have associated with the morals that zoning protect. It's our classic single-family house with the picket white fence. So zoning has been around in the US for about 100 years. In the early editions of zoning as we have it today, there were prior explicitly racial zoning ordinances that the Supreme Court struck down. So what we have today is based on primarily based on what's called Euclidean zoning, and that's based on the single family dwelling. But there were essentially three pillars of issues that were looked at. So what uses were allowed where, how high you could build your buildings, and then how those buildings are situated. So things like how big your lots can be and how close the building can be to the property lines. Today, I would suggest that those three are still part of the three pillars, but height and area kind of have been grouped together, and parking has sort of taken over as the third big pillar of zoning. However, zoning covers lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of other things. We've had zoning in Pittsburgh since 1923. It was a 23-page pamphlet. In 1956, we got what is considered modern zoning, and that's the 200-plus page document that is now probably closer to 600 pages. I don't know if anybody actually knows, because the page numbering is all screwed up in this. In 1999, we had a major overhaul of our zoning code, but it kind of just repackaged what was there before. There were definitely changes, there were definitely tweaks, but it wasn't starting over. So we're still dealing with a lot of the things that were established in the 1950s. And since then, we've had some amendments. Things like urban agriculture became a thing, medical marijuana became a thing. We probably have an oil and gas amendment in there somewhere. And all these different things get added on to the existing ordinance. And it becomes this very
Labyrinthian.
yes, little product. Oh yeah, I always forget how many bandages I've added on there. There's quite a few. So going back to kind of like how I've gotten to where I am now, this was my daily life at the zoning office, was looking at the zoning map every single day, looking at a particular parcel, what is that zoning district, and just focusing in and zooming in on a single parcel issue. And yes, there are 1,000,001 issues for that parcel in zoning, depending on what the situation is. But when I left the city, I started looking at the zoning map as a whole, and I started noticing some patterns. And so given the residential districts are the tan and yellow colors, they're kind of hard to tell apart, but because I've been working in zoning for a long time, I looked at this and I was like, wait, that's a cluster of multifamily zoning districts, multifamily zoning districts, multifamily zoning. You know, each of those circles has a substantial cluster of multifamily zoning. But these two clusters, Shadyside, Oakland, Squirrel Hill, high student population. The other clusters have like 80% or more black populations. And so I started asking the question of why does the multifamily zoning seem to be concentrated in those areas? Around the universities, that makes sense. But why is it concentrated in, and is it actually concentrated in black areas? So this question also came about when looking particularly at Point Breeze North and the Homewood neighborhoods. I lived in this 12-unit apartment building built in 1927 or something like that, that's in a single-family residential zoning district. On the street, there are multiple other apartment buildings of that era. There are some quadplexes, duplexes, and single-family dwellings. But the zoning in that area is now single-family. And I've gotten so many questions over the years. Why is this single-family zoning district? It should be multifamily, so we can build what's already there. And then you look across the tracks, and in this area of Homewood and in other areas, it's zoned for multifamily, but the housing stock that's from a similar time period or even older as the photo on the right, or photo on the left, is a detached single-family dwelling. So one of the justifications for why zoning districts can be a certain way can be the existing built environment. It's not always what dictates what the zoning district is, but that can be one of the factors. And clearly that's not the reason for these districts. So I started looking for what other things might influence this. And a few years ago, the University of Richmond digitized all the redlining maps from the Homeowner Loan Corporation from the 1930s that graded residential areas as either good for investment, so the green and the blue are good for investment, and the yellow and red are bad for investment. You don't want to put your money there in housing because it's deteriorating or it's hazardous because it's being infiltrated by Jews, or there's a large black population here, or the Italians have started moving in. You know, so all these groups that were considered not desirable in the 1930s, if they were moving in or if they already existed in large numbers, those areas were graded as don't invest here in housing. These maps were used by banking for a long time. In the 1970s, I believe it was, the Supreme Court said, this is illegal, don't do this anymore. However, we still see the repercussions of the use of these maps in banking. And other maps were made at the same time, like the zoning maps have existed and were, and the city planning department gave data to the homeowner loan corporation to make this map. And the city planning department made the zoning map. So there's ties between who's making these maps. The other thing, looking at Point Breeze and Homewood, is there's a very distinct racial difference. So in the Homewood neighborhoods, again, it's 80–90% black residents. Point Breeze North is about 50-50, but it's been declining in the black population, so it's moving more white in the recent years. And Point Breeze itself is like 90% white or something like that. So again, this seemed like another potential factor in why we have one district versus the other, because again, going back to the morals of zoning is to protect and promote the single family dwelling. And so we want to protect and promote that for the people that are desirable, which would be the white people, and the people who are not desirable can live in not desirable housing. That's, very editorialized assessment right there. So to try and understand a little bit more what's going on, I was able to take a look at the 1927, 1967, and the 2021 zoning maps for the city of Pittsburgh. 1927 is 4 years after we've adopted zoning. It's our first map that has an exclusive single-family zoning district. So the gray areas, which are primarily concentrated around the Shady Side Squirrel Hill area, are the very first exclusive single-family zoning districts in the city. So that's a very important milestone in our zoning history. And as time has gone on, we've gotten more districts, and so you get till you get the very
patchwork.
Yes, very patchwork, that's a good word for it. And very small, like a lot of these zoning districts cover 1% of the city, or varying amounts of the city, but almost all of them are very, very small portions of the city. So, because we have a lot of zoning districts, but they're not all residential. So I was looking at those three maps. I was looking at the redlining map for the city of Pittsburgh, and I was looking at the racial composition from around the time of those three zoning maps. And I used the percentage of white residents by census tract, because over time variables change, and that was the most consistent racial demographic that I could find across all the 3 time points. So what I found when looking just at the residential districts, so there are residential districts, there are commercial districts, and there are industrial districts, and there might be districts that allow residential and commercial. I was looking just at the ones that allow residential only. So in those districts today, 29% of the multifamily zoning districts that are covering areas that were graded by the redlining map in the 1930s, 29% of those received positive grades. The rest of them were negative grades, do not invest in this area. On the other hand, the single-family districts that were graded in 1930s, 54% of those districts today received a positive grade in the 1930s. And the trend over the 3 years is in the first 1927 map, almost like, I think it's like 99% of the single family zoning districts were what then became positive graded areas. So very, very strong correlation. Again, the city planning department made that map and then gave data to the homeowner loan corporation to make their map. So very strong correlation between single family areas and areas that were good for investment. Over time, that has reduced my interpretation for how, for why single-family zoning districts aren't quite as strongly correlated to the good graded areas anymore is because we didn't have that many. So as single family districts grow across the city, they're bound to run out of areas that were considered good grades in the 1930s. But at the same time, the multifamily districts had about a 63% correlation to negatively graded areas in the city, and it's stayed fairly consistent in that area across all 3 years. So while there's been more diversity with the single family districts, multifamily districts are still highly concentrated in areas that were considered bad for investment in the 1930s. On the racial side, today, 54% of the multifamily zoning districts are in areas of the city without a supermajority of white residents. And I use the supermajority of white residents because there's tendency to freak out if you have issues with people who don't look like you. If you see more than 1 out of every 3 people doesn't look like you, that's enough for people to start getting anxiety. But then the single family districts, 77% of our single family districts are in areas with a supermajority of white residents. So there's a very clear distinction that if you're white, chances are good that you're going to be living in a single family district area. If you're black, probably a lot lower chance. And the trend over time for this was also very fascinating. So again, the single family districts is the blue line, and that has been getting more diverse. But that diversity is following almost exactly the citywide diversity. So it's not that we've become more welcoming of allowing other people into our single family districts, it's just we've become slightly more diverse cities, so our single family districts have become slightly more diverse. The multifamily districts, on the other hand, have gone from being not necessarily in areas where there were high concentrations of black or other minority residents to over 50%, again, are now in black or other minority areas. So something is going on here. Another trend in the last 100 years is the amount of land given to multifamily residential has shrunk exponentially. So it's shrunk exponentially, and it's exponentially grown in black neighborhoods. So again, there seems to be a correlation between race and multifamily zoning. So whenever you do research, people ask, so what? Is that what you're gonna ask? For me, the so what comes back to this idea that the morals that zoning is trying to protect is the moral way of living that's a single family dwelling, detached, preferably with that picket white fence. And the evidence that I'm finding is that if you were white, you were welcomed and invited to live in this ideal and moral single family dwelling. If you were black or another group that was considered not desirable, you're not given the option to live in the moral housing, perhaps because you already are considered immoral. Again, speculating here, but there is a correlation between definitely targeting single family housing to white families and thereby not allowing it for others. And zoning, in my opinion, does play a role in that picture. And so on my website for this research, there are a few more examples of the impacts of what this means when you have multi-unit zoning. This is one of the ones that I feel like is the most clear representation of the impacts. Because part of the question is, well, in Pittsburgh, in a multifamily zoning district, you can still build single family dwellings, which is very true. You could build anything from a 1 unit to 200 or more unit apartment in a multifamily zoning district. So the problem that I see, though, is we've been using the multifamily zoning district to demolish blocks of single-family dwellings to build apartment buildings. Granted, those apartment buildings have since been demolished and have been rebuilt. But that was one of this zoning enabled the urban renewal of the 1950s, where we moved black people from areas like the Hill District that had less height-wise dense housing and put them in blocks of apartments. Another impact I did not include in the slide deck today is that when you do build a single-family dwelling in these districts, the setbacks are designed for building a large apartment tower. So you have lots, like big setbacks that don't make any sense for the type of housing that's being built now. And it doesn't meet the context of the housing that was built before the apartments were built. So you get this very disjointed feel because you have some buildings built up to the street, other buildings are being built 20, 30 feet back because of the current zoning. So it's creating a lot of uncomfortable spaces in the city. So because we're talking here to an advocacy group of pro-housing, some of the question is, I guess there are two questions. There's what do we do to change, which is still, perhaps is still an open question, but how do we change? Because something does need to change so we can build more housing so that we have fewer unhoused people or underhoused people. So let's see. Going back to my experience working in the city of Pittsburgh zoning office and knowing we have issues, I was frequently very frustrated about the fact that we weren't able to do anything as staff knowing these issues. So, and I will also add that this was under a previous administration, so things may work a little differently now than they did when I was there. But sidewalk cafes are like my pet peeve project because sidewalk cafes are a great thing. Everybody wants a sidewalk cafe. Mayor Peduto at the time wanted Pittsburgh to be the Paris of Appalachia with sidewalk cafes. Sidewalk cafe applications would come in, 90% of them I had to deny because they did not comply with the zoning requirements. And the zoning requirements, frankly, were stupid. They were just bad. So every year we'd get a ton of applications. 90% of them we would turn away. Those that didn't have money or had very little money, mom and pop kinds of restaurants, they disappeared. Those that had money, they went to the ZBA. They got their sidewalk cafes on the other side of the street. They got them to be permanent sidewalk cafes. And again, this is all pre-COVID, so that has also changed the picture quite a bit about sidewalk cafes. But those things were unheard of. But if you had money, you went to the ZBA and you got your variance and you got your sidewalk cafe however you wanted to have your sidewalk cafe. But if you didn't have money, didn't understand the process, you disappeared. And staff, like me, would say, why can't we change the zoning code so that the people without money can also get their sidewalk cafes? And I did not get any very clear answers, but basically we did not update the zoning code.
Carolyn, there's a happy ending to that story.
Yes, there is.
Yes.
I will get to the happy ending.
Right.
Yes. So the so my interpretation at that time is based on the amendments that I did see happening in our zoning code. Because it wasn't that we weren't updating our zoning. We had amendments every few months. The thing that was different about the sidewalk cafes was there wasn't a loud enough voice or a large enough group of people going to the mayor and city council and saying, the sidewalk cafe regulations suck, change them. But on other issues, there were a large enough group of people going to the mayor and city council and saying, XYZ sucks, or we don't even have regulations on ABC. Let's change this. And magically the change happened. So my theory was, if those 90% applications that I denied, if all of those people went to the mayor and the city council, we would have changed our sidewalk cafe regulations. Now again, this is a little bit outdated. Eventually somebody must have complained, because the other thing about sidewalk cafes is they fall under everybody's umbrella. So zoning has a say in it. At the time, the Department of Public Works had a say in it. The building department has a say in it. And so 3 departments all have their own separate regulations to review sidewalk cafes and make a mess. So somebody complained enough that the mayor's office said, all right, we are going to fix sidewalk cafe regulations by fixing the public works regulations. And so now, and this happened while I was still there, so we find out about this after it's been adopted. And I'm freaking out. I'm like, how did this happen? I've been asking and asking for years to change the zoning regulations for sidewalk cafes. The Department of Public Works regulations have changed, and so now they are completely out of sync with the zoning regulations. They didn't talk to each other very well before. They really don't talk to each other now. This has made more of a mess. Like, oh my gosh. In the meantime, I leave the city, and somehow, so I don't know exactly how this happened, but it did come about that one of my coworkers did end up picking up the torch, I guess, and the zoning code has been fixed for sidewalk cafes as well. But it took an awful long time. So this is, my interpretation of what needs my interpretation plus the actual legal path forward to making changes to the zoning code. So based on my experience in the city of Pittsburgh, the first thing that you need is the political will to make the change. So even if the staff knows, because I had data, I had charts, I had, I was very, very detail oriented and got all the stuff together, took it to my boss so that we could have the proof that we need to change sidewalk cafes. That wasn't enough. Having the data wasn't enough. Having the political will, because the community asked for something, and potentially the right part of the community asked for something, was the first step. So once there is that political will, then staff, or it actually could be an outside group, but frequently staff drafts the amendment, writes it up, figures out what it's going to say. Then it goes to the Planning Commission for recommendation, and then it goes to City Council for adoption. And there are public hearings at both of these last stages, so plenty of opportunity for the loud voices to come into the room and share their thoughts and opinions on whatever the proposed amendment is. So based on my experiences, I'm suggesting that the role of groups like this are to help raise those key issues, help identify what the problems are, and help be that loud vocal voice to make those issues heard by the council, by the mayor's office, by the planning commission. But as you're doing it, it's really, really important that you identify clear goals. I have seen many amendments that were very well intentioned. The issues that the community were raising, what they wanted, makes good sense. They were well intentioned, they got written and implemented, and they're terrible. And it's not because it was the wrong issue being argued for, it was because the goals weren't clear and they got translated into messy language and messy goals, which made messy regulations and ended up creating more processes and more headaches than the ones that they were trying to solve. So making sure you identify the clear goals, and as you're doing that, again, going back to this issue of having the messy amendments that don't actually solve the problems, you want to help find the solutions that are going to actually help the problems, the way to word it, or the approach that is going to solve the problem, and make sure those solutions are reality tested. Because there's lots of good theories out there, but when you get on the ground and you try to implement them in zoning, it can break very quickly. And also just helping to educate the decision makers and the community on what the issues are and what good solutions are for those issues. Especially around zoning, there's a lot of egos, there's a lot of personal emotion invested in issues around zoning. I'm pointing back to the single-family dwelling as the only moral way to live. That's baked into the American dream, which is sort of the essential philosophy of our country. And so saying we need to do something other than single-family housing gets to some very, very core fundamental beliefs. And it gets messy quickly if we don't present it in a clear way, in a way that's going to get everybody on board. The other thing, part of the reason why parking is now one of the third pillars, don't you dare suggest you take away a parking space, because that will immediately get everybody upset. But there, we were kind of talking about a little bit in the opening remarks. Parking is tied to how we develop the land, and there are other ways of getting around. People have different desires for how they want to live. Different housing options work better for different people. I'm a reformed homeowner. I now rent. After my experience of being a single homeowner, that wasn't the right kind of housing for me. So I am very much a proponent of finding the right kind of housing for you and your circumstances. Zoning is trying to get us all to be single-family homeowners. So we need to, but again, it gets back to these core issues. So there is a role that I feel like groups like this can play to help open up the conversation, to help get the concepts out there that we're not saying you can't live in a single-family dwelling. We're saying not everybody wants to live in a single-family dwelling. Just trying to get those kinds of conversations going, because people like me can only do so much. For my last slide, on the left-hand side is stuff that I've been working on. So residentialzoningbyrrace.com has the full results of the research that I did last year. You can email me at carolyn@detailsreviewed.com. As I mentioned, morals and zoning is one of the things that I'm digging deeper into. So I am mapping morals and zoning across the country, so you can follow that website as well. You can follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I regularly post on every Monday. It's Morals Monday, so there's a new post about morals and zoning on Mondays, and other things throughout the week. The right-hand side is a recommended reading list. It's a very short sampling of relevant topics, and of course, top on the list is my book, because everybody should read Zoning Adventures. Zoning in the USA is a really great overview of how zoning works in the USA. Arbitrary Lines, as somebody mentioned, is another book. It has some really great chapters, has other chapters that have strong disagreement with his approach, but overall it's a great, his fundamental philosophy is that we need to get rid of zoning, and I fundamentally agree we need to get rid of zoning as we know it today. So we do have a lot in common. And there's some really good chapters on just how zoning works. So it has some good introduction to that. And then the last two are coming back to this idea of not everybody wants to or should have to live in a single-family home. So Brave New Home by Diana Lind talks about a variety of alternative housing types, most of which are not permitted in zoning codes, or if they are very limited in where they can go, and they have an immense amount of criteria that you have to meet in order to be able to build that. Living Downtown is one of my most recent finds, and I'm so excited about this book. It was very well written. I could only find it at CMU's library, so it's a little bit hard to find, but if you can find it, definitely worthwhile. It's talking about what we could broadly call as the single room occupancy housing type, but it's talking about that across the entire economic spectrum. 100 years ago, people at every income level would choose to live in single room occupancies. At the high end, it would be places like the William Penn Hotel. that they would be living in. The low end, it's the YMCA's and the Salvation Army. But then there was everything in between. And that type of housing is almost entirely illegal at this point. There are one or two uses that kind of sort of fit that, but it's one of the ones that has been perhaps the most stringently eliminated from zoning ordinances. And as I was reading it, you know, I recently made the shift of moving from being a homeowner back to being a renter, but as I'm reading about the single room occupancy, I was like, that's really what I was looking for. It just doesn't exist anymore. So anyway, that's my very short recommended reading list. I read lots of books a year, so I could recommend many more, I'm sure, and I have a stack of zoning books to read. So there's lots of good material out there. I'm also working on writing more. Don't know when they'll be published, but eventually there will also be more material that I've written. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to me talk about zoning, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Really appreciate everyone coming out. I know I can hang around for a little while, Carolyn. Hopefully you can hang around.
Yeah, I don't have anything
We can
to say.
keep the discussion going, but I did say 8:30 would be the end, and it is 8:32 right now, so we're a little late. But I thought this was an incredible discussion. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
The subject matter was so interesting, and I think it really highlights not only, like, you know, of course affordability matters, but at the end of the day, like, the racism in our zoning is a moral issue that we now have to contend with as a society, and we need to be the ones pushing to change that. So, you know, obviously, like, the end goal of this is make housing abundant, make housing affordable, but, you know, also another good reason, it's all rooted in racism, and we should try to fix that. So I'm glad you were able to come talk to us about this, because it really opened my eyes to really how bad it is. I always understood that it was somewhat rooted in racism, but now I really understand it was rooted in racism. So yeah, Carolyn, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch with everybody about the meeting next month. But thanks again for attending.